now. And then also add in Kim as our, let's see here, pinned, and also myself. Okay. We are having some technical difficulties here. Just give me one moment. I'll remove the pin here. So before I introduce today's co-presenters, I want to offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Planning Committee. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are currently occupying ancestral land of the Tongva people. In our work to promote social justice and education, we must always consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us together here today. With that being said, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's presentation to kick things off for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. This is Glendale Community College's second year observing Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And this year's theme is APITA Resilience, Finding Strength Through Community. APITA standing for Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American. The Planning Committee has selected this theme to emphasize the immense resilience found within the APITA community, despite the various challenges that they've faced in this country. It's an honor to introduce my dear colleagues, Mike Dulai and Richard Kamei. Mike Dulai currently serves as Professor of Psychology and Chair of the Social Sciences Division, and Richard Kamei serves as the Assistant Social Sciences Division Chair, Sociology Department Chair, and Professor of Sociology here at GCC. As a result of the significant rise in anti-Asian American Pacific Islander bias and hate crimes, Professors Dulai and Kamei will explore the factors associated with the long history of anti-AAPI sentiments and actions within the United States. As a part of this discussion, they will also highlight the history of resilience within the diverse AAPI communities. With that being said, I'd like to introduce Professors Dulai and Kamei.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kev.
So welcome, everybody. I'm going to jump right in and get the ball rolling. Richard and I have talked about this quite a bit, so it's highly likely that what we'll be doing is having a conversation as the slides advance. We both have different training, but I think lots of similar experiences. And my hope is that that's going to come together and provide for an entertaining and very informative session this evening. So let's start with a look at resiliency. And when I think of resiliency, particularly as it's related to this topic, I'm drawn to bamboo. Those of you that have ever been around bamboo as it grows, or if you've ever tried to remove bamboo, I think you can appreciate how strong its roots are, right? It's one of those plants that will grow through anything and establish itself and will resist rain, wind. It can be cut down and it'll grow right back. And so that's really the spirit from which I'd like to draw upon as we move through the lecture this evening. Let me begin by briefly stating that I'm a psychologist by training, but I have taught ethnic studies in our ethnic studies program, and my research in psychology was on Asian American psychology in particular. So I spent quite some time trying to understand the experience of Asian Americans. Richard, Professor Kamei is the head of our sociology department, so his training's obviously going to encompass a much broader lens than mine. And so I'd like to begin by transitioning to one of the great sociologists.
Indeed. So we have the brilliant sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois here, and he basically stated back in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So he couldn't be more prophetic. The question is, though, because I'm certain that everyone would agree that this has been a significant issue throughout the 20th century, but is it the issue of the 21st century? So here we have, is the color line still a problem in the 21st century? And so here, I don't mind if people chime in, chat if they like to, or say what they think, yes, no. What are people's thoughts on this? Is it still a problem? Yeah, okay, you think it is. All right, so the question ends up being, why is it a problem, right? And so we know from our history that we have a highly racialized and stratified society. I mean, it goes back at least 400 years where the Black, Indigenous, people of color have been fighting, against these forces that have been used to oppress and control them. And so when you see this image, right, this graphic kind of developing, you see that we are a highly racialized society where we use race oftentimes to try to understand, unfortunately, each other as if there are essential characteristics of people based upon these socially constructed categories that we call race. But what's also important to understand is the stratification that we're talking about. So it's not only racial stratification, but there is also social class stratification. So as you see here, we have in our society, unfortunately, a highly unequal nation where you have 1% of the nation owning about 40% of the wealth, right? And then you have the bottom 90% with very little. And unfortunately, race plays into this. But what is important to understand is that what divides us is important to examine so that we can be united in trying to struggle against these forces that keep us separate and unequal. So, on this chart, you also see this notion of cultural hegemony. So there is a question of how does it continue, right? So we know that racism has been a problem for 400 years, but what keeps it in place? And in the early 20th century, there's an intellectual by the name of Antonio Gramsci who developed the notion of what you see up there, cultural hegemony, which refers to the dominant ideology or the set of beliefs that pervades a culture of a society that maintains the social, economic, and political arrangements that serve the interests of the ruling class. And through socialization, unfortunately, people end up accepting these ideas that reinforce the inequality and maintain the interests of the elite. And what's important here is that it also impacts the white working class as well. So at one level, racism may provide a certain level of privilege, but when it comes to their real lived conditions, racism actually undermines their ability to reach a higher position, greater access to resources, etc. Oh, thanks. So Mike and I were going over these slides. And so with racism, how does it play into this dominant ideology, right? And so it's an important part in terms of how it keeps groups separated. So as you can see here at the very bottom, it can undermine the power of the working class by dividing them along racial lines. We still see this today, where people may, because of unfortunate prejudice, racist notions, not unite, right? In the struggle for better lives, social justice, etc. And these notions of race, and of course, it goes far beyond race. W.E.B. Du Bois by the 1950s fully understood, right? And he's writing about the complexities of all these different forms of discrimination on people's lives. But in the United States, race is a major force. And it has intersected with, of course, sex, but also with class. And when we see this on the left, are they used to justify extreme forms of exploitation? Absolutely, right? From the very beginning, racism has been used to justify extreme forms of exploitation, such as slavery, the genocide of indigenous folks, the stealing of Native American land, and even bringing it up more towards the present, the severe exploitation of Asian Americans, or even the placement of immigrants, right, in private prisons and capitalizing off of that, basically a form of exploitation. And so it's absolutely tied to the system.
Yeah, I was, if I could, I wanted to add to that with
Please.
an example, right? So if we look at cultural hegemony, as you see at the top of the screen, right, that the idea here is that socialization is going to create a system so that the dominant culture maintains its power by making sure that all other groups accept that culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you see on the screen here is actually an image of two different people, as you can imagine. The woman on the right, anyone know who that is? That's an easy one. In the United States, I think it's a terrific example of hegemony, right? That's Marilyn Monroe. And then on the left of your screen is Mei Ling. That Mei Ling here, this is actually the wife of Chiang Kai-shek. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Asian history, not Asian American history. She's a very, very powerful force in political history in Asia and as it affected other countries around the world. But I want you to think about the names Mei Ling and Marilyn for a moment and to really bring life to what it might mean to grow up with one name or the other. I'm going to use an example of a poem actually written by Marilyn Chin. It's one of my favorites. So let's hear the author actually read this poem. I'll change the pages on the right as she moves through it.
How I Got That Name, an essay on assimilation by Marilyn Chin. I am Marilyn Mei Ling Chin. Oh, how I love the resoluteness of that first person singular, followed by that stalwart indicative, a B, without that uncertain ing of becoming. Of course, the name had been changed somewhere between Angel Island and the sea, when my father, the paper son, in the late 1950s, obsessed with a bombshell blonde, transliterated Mei Ling to Marilyn. Nobody dared question his initial impulse, for we all know lust drove men to greatness, not goodness, not decency. And there I was, a wayward pink baby, named after some tragic white woman, swollen with gin and Nembutal. My mother couldn't pronounce the R. She dubbed me #1 female offshoot for brevity. Henceforth she will live and die in sublime ignorance, flanked by loving children and the kitchen deity. But my father dithers, a tomcat in Hong Kong trash, a gambler, a petty thug who bought a chain of chop suey joints in Piss River, Oregon, with bootleg Gucci cash. Nobody dared question his integrity, given his nice, devout daughters and his bright, industrious sons, as if filial piety were the standard by which all earthly men were measured. Oh, how trustworthy our daughters, how thrifty our sons, how we managed to fool the experts in education, statistics, and demography. We're not very creative, but not adverse to rote learning, rote learning, rote learning. Indeed, they can use us, but the model minority is a tease. We know you are watching now and refuse to give you any. Oh, bamboo shoots, the further west we go, we'll hit east. The deeper down we dig, we'll find China. History has turned its stomach on a black, polluted beach where life doesn't hinge on that red wheelbarrow. But whether or not a new lover and that final episode of Santa Barbara will lean over a scented candle and call us a bitch. Oh Lord, where have we gone wrong? We have no inner resources. Then one redolent spring morning, the great patriarch Chin peered down from his kiosk in heaven and saw that his descendants were ugly. One had a squarish head and a nose without a bridge. Another's profile long and knobbed as a gourd. A third, the sad, brutish one, may never, never marry. And I, his least favorite, not quite boiled, not quite cooked, a plump pomfret simmering in my juices. Too listless to fight for my people's destiny. To kill without resistance is not slaughter, says the proverb. So I wait for imminent death. The fact that this death is also metaphorical is testament to my lethargy. So here lies Marilyn Mei Ling Chin, married once, twice to so-and-so, a Lee and a Wong, daughter of the virtuous Yuequin Wong and Gigi Chin, the infamous, sister of a dozen, cousin of a million, survived by everybody and forgotten by all. She was neither black nor white, neither cherished nor vanquished. just another squatter on Bamboo Grove, minding her poetry, when one day heaven wasn't merciful, and a chasm opened where she stood, like the jaws of a mighty white whale, or the maw of a metaphysical Godzilla. It swallowed her whole. She not flinch, nor writhe, nor fret about the afterlife, but stayed solid as wood, happily, a little gnawed, tattered, mesmerized by all that was lavished upon her and all that was taken away.
I love a good poem. I hope that was powerful for you. It's one of the more powerful poems that I was introduced to when I was in college, like last year. No, I'm just joking. It was a longer, it was a while ago. But what's beautiful about this poem is that I think it compels you to feel more than what you might if you were just thinking about what the media tells you an Asian American is. Right? It's rich. It pulls you in multiple directions. It's read wonderfully. And it introduces a whole lot of history that most people don't know, understand, or are even remotely interested in. So our hope today is that we can dive into some of that first by considering where we are right now in Asian America. And to do that, I'm just going to present a few pictures here. Unfortunately, some of these instances have been all over the news, and there are far more of them than I think we care to acknowledge. And in fact, even those of us that are aware might still underestimate the numbers that we see. To think about those numbers, I'm going to pass this on again to Richard.
Okay.
And
yes, so when we think about today, right? Can you go back one slide, Mike?
absolutely.
So that's one of the first things that often come to mind. Like, okay, the challenges facing Asian American communities today would be the hate crimes that we see all over the news, and it's complicated, right? When you think about it, because the Asian American community is vast, right? It's not monolithic. We've got many different ethnicities, several ethnicities with various social classes that are represented, that are impacted differently by the hate crimes. But even with regards to challenges, other challenges that we face would be issues like domestic violence, right? Intimate partner violence. We've got deportation, which we might have a chance to talk about today. We have significant unemployment rates, right? So we have this notion of the model minority. So this aspect of our communities is often ignored. In fact, after the pandemic, many of our communities, the Asian American communities, had seen the highest spike in unemployment rates in areas like New York City. We've got extreme poverty amongst various ethnic groups, and even within a single group, there are huge gaps between those that are relatively well-to-do to those that are poor, right? On top of that, we've got issues of gang violence and other forms of discrimination. So I think it's really important that we kind of keep that in mind as we talk about challenges that face Asian Americans. Some of us have been writing about this for a while, but for many people, unfortunately, the Asian American experience, if you could call it that, is it disappears, right, from sight. So there's a certain lack of knowledge, unfortunately. So hopefully we could raise some awareness today. Cool.
Yeah, and continuing that, right, by looking at the numbers, right? Again, what I suggested as an underestimate.
Yes.
Yeah, so hate crimes have skyrocketed, all right, in recent years. Rich was just looking this up, and so as you see on the screen there, right, according to Stop AAPI Hate, if you look at that, that's a year span, my friends, right? From March 2020 to the end of March 2021, there have been 6,603 hate crimes against Asian Americans, which include murders. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino found that Asian American hate crime increased by 150% in America's largest cities since the pandemic started. And most feel that these numbers are underreported because as you may understand, right, within the Asian American community, there's in some groups, there's a tendency to not want to cause trouble. And so they don't want to inconvenience other folks. And so some of these crimes end up being underreported. Now, it's important to ask this question, right? Is this new? Is this trend really just a result of hate mongering by the former president, right? Is it really just because we've heard these messages about a Kung flu? Do you think that that's the case? Is this new? Shout it out or stick it in the chat.
Nice. So here I see definitely not. It's historical. No. Yeah, there is a long history. Now, it is important to note, right, that the spike is due to the rhetoric. I mean, so during Donald Trump's administration, he began to refer to COVID-19 as the China virus, Wuhan virus, Kung flu, and the World Health Organization warned that this kind of language, right, this type of rhetoric was going to lead to a backlash against Asians. And in fact, epidemiologists at UC San Francisco conducted a study, and they found that yes, this language, the social media pundits, or the media pundits, excuse me, and social media amplifying these ideas, right, in the minds of individuals has definitely increased the hate and hate crimes against Asian Americans. But you guys are absolutely correct. We're just recording and documenting now. That's another factor, right? A lot of it has been undocumented, unfortunately. But what Donald Trump did is he basically tapped into this long history of scapegoating minorities, marginalized groups, and Asian Americans. And so we will be discussing about how this isn't new, right? It does have a long history.
Yeah, so let's look at another thinker from the past, right? Sometimes claimed as a sociologist to help understand this. Rich?
Oh, sure. Yes, and so attempting to understand hate crimes, we want to place these things into some type of conceptual framework as much as possible. So people long before us, like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who is a journalist, but sociologists also claim her as her own, right? That she is also a sociologist because of the work that she's done, public sociology, applied sociology. And in her works, like in 1895, she wrote A Red Record. In 1892, it was Southern Horrors. She found something extremely important that I think is very relevant for our discussion today, right? She found that, as you could read right there, there was a strong correlation between economic decline in a region and hate crimes. Now, she was focusing on lynchings, right? There's something like 4,742 lynchings from 1882 to 1968. That's recorded, and there are more than those. But when we're trying to examine hate against Asian Americans, there is a parallel that exists. In no way are we, Mike and I, arguing that it's the same, right? The degree, the extent, the totalness of it all is different. But Asian Americans have also had their fair share of violence and oppression. And when you begin to examine the historical periods in which these types of events become more problematic, right? When they spike, so to speak, it is oftentimes during periods of economic difficulty. And like in the case of African Americans, Ida B. Wells Barnett pointed out that rape was often used to justify lynchings, but the real purpose was to undermine Black economic progress. And you also see when Asian Americans begin to make economic progress during different periods of our history, we become targets of hate as well. So often, right, when the economy's in decline, we scapegoat immigrants, right? That's been a consistent thing from the past. And we often, when we see marginalized groups starting to rise in different periods, there have been attempts to undermine them. Now, of course, it gets complicated because race isn't stagnant and it goes through changes. And hopefully we could describe some of the ways that people are viewed and how they change throughout time. But there still are some consistencies.
Yeah, in fact, extending upon what Rich just said, it isn't to say that the experiences within the Asian American community are identical to those suffered by Black America. There's a very, very different sets of circumstance. But what I think is important to look at are the parallel experiences of all people perceived as inferior, right? All people. So this is what these characteristics I think will certainly be true for Asian Americans in Asian American history, but there are trends that end up coloring the experiences of many other groups. So people who are perceived as inferior are often viewed as unequal. They are called heathens, savages. They're given the branding of being lustful, right? They're accused of having low morals. There's a fear of any possible racial mixing. Actually, that gets translated into law, as we'll see, right? They're isolated socially, politically, and economically into ghettos. They're frequently used as scapegoats. They are denied access to political participation, and they experience various attempts to control population growth, right? Legal and illegal. The idea here is that those folks who are viewed as inferior are not given the capacity to acquire any kind of power within the system or to grow, right? Political power, economic power, any power seems to be denied of them. And so this is the framework that I'd like to use to, right, launch us into the next portion of this presentation, right? And that's really here that if we're going to celebrate resilience, if we're going to look at the resilience within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we have to understand our past. So there's a series of images on the screen here, and as we move through the rest of this talk, you'll get to, I think, a good appreciation of some of them, right? At the top right, you see an image of Korean American field workers in Hawaii. At the top left, you see 3 boys behind barbed wire fence in an internment camp during World War II. Smack in the middle at the top there, you might see, if you looked at the sign carefully, that's actually a Sikh American who fought for the Union in the Civil War. Again, that's not something most of us would place, right? The bottom right of your screen, you see Chinese railroad workers. The next 3 images the 3 images next to that are, of course, Filipino field workers in the early part of California's history. And then at the bottom right is a fellow draftsman named Vincent Chin, whose case we'll talk about as we move through, again, the next portion of the talk. So let's start with just a framework for understanding the overall Asian American experience, right? We can look at groups in the United States, if we're looking at their histories. One way we understand history is by labeling folks, and in this case, I'll focus on Asian Americans, right, as dysfunctional, right? That Asian Americans disrupt society. So what they need to do is engage in what sometimes is referred to as Anglo-conformity, right? They have to adapt and assimilate. This is, this is a generational thing, but, in the 80s and 70s, there was a series called Schoolhouse Rock. The series, they had this one song called The Great American Melting Pot. And the idea was that people would come in and they'd all melt, and then it was pitched as though we would all blend into each other. But really what was happening is that, right, Mei Ling might come out as a Marilyn, right? Anyone in our class have a name that was given to them by their parents, but you also had to take on an American name? It's one of those unfortunate realities for many Asians in the United States, right? You had to have a different name. So that's a dysfunctional lens of looking at the Asian American experience. Another lens is to see Asian Americans as victims, right? That they're victimized. And so this lens is sometimes used to create feelings of guilt in the dominant group. So as we'll see tonight when we look at some of these cases, right? Some of the instances that Richard was describing earlier, right? This is not intended to try to make another group feel bad. But that lens is sometimes used when we're looking at the experiences of other groups. We also, I think, in particular, Asian Americans are haunted by the idea of the model minority myth, right? So that's a celebratory lens where we selectively emphasize certain accomplishments of different Asian American groups. And that becomes its own burden when, right, a Hmong American who moved here after the Vietnam War is treated as though he was a 4th generation Japanese American born to a wealthy, successful family, right? But because there's this perception of being a foreigner, right, we sometimes brand all people that look one way with this broad brush. That's also, I'm going to argue, a mistake. Ideally, what we do when we look at the experience of Asians in America is we see their experience as participatory, right? We see their experience as participants, in that we see Asian Americans being an integral part of the development of the United States.
Yes.
So as we move through these, the history of the Asian American experience, I urge you to consider that, right? This is not about feeling bad. It's not about looking for dysfunction. It's not about celebrating the one-off that something great happened. It's really about looking at the whole thing, the macro lens, which is why I very much enjoy working with folks who study sociology, because it's a broad lens.
Absolutely. Oh, and on this chart, I
Yes.
just want to bring us back to the celebratory, this notion of the model minority, right? It's really important for us to examine it, because at one level, it seems like a positive stereotype, and who wouldn't want to be considered model, perhaps? But when we think about when it was developed, right, back in the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement, it's important to examine why, right? What function it served. And in many ways, it was used to undermine the movement, to say that what are others complaining about? America is the land of opportunity. Look, if you're quiet and you work hard enough, you can make it. But what it does is it takes on this essentialist character, as if there are good minorities and bad minorities, and all people of a particular racial category somehow fit under that description. And so it has been very devastating. On Wednesday, we're going to have some folks that are social activists from the Asian American community talk about the challenges from decades past to the present. And a lot of our issues get ignored because of it, right? On top of what Mike was pointing out, it is a very difficult standard to try to live up to as well for many of us, because it is in many regards unrealistic. On the other side, though, we have this tendency to ignore the success, talent, and hard work of folks of other so-called racial categories. And so in essence, it is problematic for those reasons. Plus, it can be very divisive as well. And we'll often come back to this notion of dividing people within our society, whether by design or that's still the result, right, of these particular notions, like the stereotype I just mentioned.
Yeah. So let's take that, and then now let's dive in and looking at, again, broad 10,000-foot view here of the early history of Asians in America. One of the ways, I would argue actually the most effective way to do this is to consider patterns of immigration as being born of both push and pull factors, right? Mm-hmm. There are certain forces that push someone out of a country, and then other forces that pull them into a country. Right. And so when we look at the different waves, if you will, of Asians who immigrated to the United States, you have to weigh both. Rich and I have looked at this and talked about this and weighed, the various ways to try to approach this. There's just so much content that we're going to be selective in looking at experiences so that we can see a framework. And our hope is that you can then use that framework to examine other groups, or potentially take like a History 120 class, right? History of Asia, for example, right? Or History of the Philippines, right? And just try to find other opportunities in an ethnic studies class, for example, that will allow you to see, right, these experiences in much greater detail. But let's look at these waves, right? The first wave of Asian immigrants to enter the United States were the Chinese. And so from 1850 to about 1882, 1882 is a hard stop for the Chinese experience. We'll get to that. Mm-hmm. Chinese are pushed out of China by the Opium Wars, by a Boxer Rebellion, by imperialism, particularly from, England, and by a ticket system, right? Which was essentially a one-way ticket out of China. The wave to follow the Chinese experience is the Japanese, right? So Japanese immigrate to the United States from about 1888. And their immigration stops almost abruptly as well in about 1908, right? The forces that push Japanese out of Japan are there's a population boom that results in an economic surge, but that leads to labor unrest, and the competition for resources creates limited opportunity. And so folks who are looking to advance end up leaving. That wave is followed by Filipinos who move in the years following the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, which is not talked about very much in the United States. I'll address more of that actually on Friday if you're interested in learning more about specifically the Filipino-American experience. But the Filipinos experience the limited opportunities in the wake of both of these wars. After that, we see a wave of immigrants from India, right? Asian Indians from 1890 till about 1917. Who also fled India because of limited opportunity. And as if you know, I hope, English imperialism eventually is going to get resolved when Gandhi leads a peaceful revolution, and India establishes itself as a country, there is still, of course, many layers, right, within that country, within their social system, their caste system, that have to be unpacked. We do have courses for that. I'm happy to direct, you guys, suppose you can put questions in the chat if you want to know a recommendation. The head of our history department, I think, might be fielding the questions, so you'll get outstanding information. The wave following Asian Indian migration to the United States as a wave of Koreans, right, from 1900 to about 1905, you see a surge of Koreans entering the United States. This is going to, of course, happen again in the years following the Korean War. But these early waves, right, are pushed out again from limited opportunity and direct result to the Japanese-Russo War. That's a war between Japan and Russia. Mm-hmm. And the pull for all of these groups is this idea that there is opportunity and land in the United States, right? The United States, if you can appreciate this, has just doubled in size and is continuing to grow. Mm-hmm. And so it looks like there's this brilliant frontier where there's possibilities for everybody. And what I'd like for us to consider, right, is if you look at these waves, it's important to take a closer look, right? Because these groups are coming in waves, right? The groups do not have time to become extensively large. So it isn't like the case of immigration from England, where you just have a steady flow of people from the same country with this long lineage, right? The migration from these Asian countries is stopped abruptly, right, multiple times. And because of this, another byproduct is that the groups end up experiencing a great deal of ethnic antagonism and competition. So even though people might think of Asian Americans, right, and Chinese and Japanese, what's of course going to happen is that the Chinese and Japanese will be pitted against each other. Mm-hmm. And then the Filipinos get introduced, and that continues, right? And there's a layering that occurs.
You know, when Mike and I were talking about this, you know, we don't have that much time, unfortunately. So we're leaving out certain things that may not be as important, but something that we both agreed we should include here is the notion of Western capitalism, right? The expansion of Western capitalism. And I'll be kind of brief here, but it's an important concept. So one of the things that capitalism must do is it must continue to grow, right? And there is a crisis of overproduction that could develop where these major industrial, countries like Great Britain, the United States, are mass producing these goods, and they got to have some kind of market for them. And so they begin opening up trade, and this is very quick, but like, for example, the Opium Wars, that's a big factor that led to those Opium Wars. Or Japan back in 1853, when Commodore Perry comes over with gunboat diplomacy and forces Japan's doors open to trade. But what this does is it creates this link between the Asian nations, right, and the United States or Great Britain. But let's focus on the United States. And so in order to address the labor needs within the US, or to, like, as Mike said, divide and conquer the labor within the United States, various peoples from oftentimes colonies, right, in some cases, are being enticed to come to the United States. And what's happening in those nations, because of their attempt to rapidly industrialize, also pushes folks out. And so, like in the case of Japan, in order to rapidly industrialize, farmers were taxed at exorbitant rates. Many of them lost their land, right? And they were proletarianized, as we say. They were turned into workers, and they were looking for opportunities. And that was the pull to bring them to the United States. But it's not by accident that there weren't as many members of each group represented in the United States. And Mike will be talking about that soon too.
Yeah, and a terrific case example of that is the experience of Asian immigrants in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. Right, Hawaii, of course, at this point is not a state in of the United States. That doesn't happen until 1900. But what we have are businesses setting up and taking advantage of the existing system within Hawaii. There's a great land distribution that the king is convinced to buy into or to agree to sign off on that parses out the land, and you see plantations established. And so what happens on these sugar plantations, right, is that those companies need labor, as Rich was just describing. And so the first plantations in Hawaii actually rely heavily on Hawaiian labor, indigenous labor.
Mhm.
What happens, of course, tragically, is that the population of the native Hawaiians actually declines. And if you look at those numbers there, they're staggering, right? By 1860, it was 1/5 of the size that it was in 1778, right? Now, why does the population shrink so rapidly? This, by the way, is the same experience that happened among Native Americans on the East Coast of the United States, right? This is largely a result of disease and the fact that they were being forced into climates and conditions that they would not typically work in, right? The crops needed to get planted. And so the indigenous folks worked in ways that they never had to because they typically or historically would just sustain for themselves. And now what's happening, of course, because of the business is you're growing sugar so that it can be exported. You're no longer generating the resources that you need for yourself and your community. You're pushing this out. Now, when this happens, when the labor supply on the islands declines, the plantation owners shift to Asian labor.
Mhm.
Particularly they look for what we refer to as contract labor. This is part of that ticket system. Okay, so these numbers are going to pull Asians out of Asia. Again, they're being pushed out for various reasons, and that first group that's going to get drawn out are the Chinese. So from 1852 to 1900, over 50,000, over approximately 50,000 Chinese set foot on Hawaiian soil. They either stay there temporarily and then move on, but what most commonly occurs is that they sign contracts, and the first set of contracts in 1852 are 5-year contracts. So you work in the islands for 5 years, you get paid $3 a month, you get food and clothing. And then once the 5 years are up, they take whatever money they have left, buy a ticket to try to get to the mainland, right? To get to California. This is shifted in 1865 into 3-year contracts, right?
Sorry.
They get $8 a month, right? They get 2 sets of clothing, a warm jacket, shoes, hat, mat, pillow, and blanket. That shorter term, of course, is because it is easier to lure folks in for these shorter stints. It also means that they're going to be able to stagger their labor force and bring in other groups. So if you've been to Hawaii, if you've ever had a box plate, a bento plate or a box lunch in Hawaii, you know that it truly is a mix up there, right?
Mm-hmm.
You might get azuki beans on top of your shaved ice as you're eating Portuguese sausage, right, with your kalbi next to it,
Yeah,
and
getting
then
hungry.
right, sushi, right? I mean, it's really all the flavors of my favorite parts of the world,
Mhm.
but that occurs because of this breaking up, this division among groups.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take that, right, with this in mind, and let's shift and follow the experience of these Chinese immigrants to California, right? And to do that, just kind of put, let's look at population shifts, right, and migration shifts. And the most significant thing, of course, that happens in California is the gold rush, right? Gold is discovered in California, and as you probably know, there's a surge of people from, particularly, obviously, from the East Coast who are flooding to California to try to get gold, right? They want to get some of that success, some of that opportunity. And so the Chinese do the same thing. They move toward California. And so in 1852, right, the estimates are that there are 20,000 Chinese in California. What happens next is, I think, fascinating. You just see a small growth in the Chinese population. And there are 2 reasons for that, right? One is there's a gold rush that occurs in Australia, which is, right, just simple geography, that's closer to China. And so some of the Chinese are getting pushed out of China, shift down and move to Australia. There's also something that occurs that is, I think, important to understand because it's the first of many, and we'll get to a whole list of legal barriers that get erected in the way of Asian American progress. The state of California establishes a foreign miners tax, which is supposed to be for foreigners, but it is applied almost uniformly to Chinese and Latino miners. Right, and so you're charged $20 a month to mine. That's not going to encourage you to continue to mine. What happens after this is you start to see another surge in population in California, and that's really because of the railroad industry. Right, So by 1854, we see about 40,000 Chinese in California, and that number continues to climb, right, based on the needs of the railroads. So let's look at the other jobs, right? We'll look at railroads, of course, but I also want us to consider the other kinds of labor that Chinese engage in while they're in the United States, while they're in California in particular, right? So there's mining, we talked about that briefly. There's farming, right? That Chinese immigrants find work as tenant farmers. Tenant meaning, right, that they don't own the land. They come in and then they rent part of the land. They harvest what they can. Money goes to the owner of the land, and then they sell what they can. It's one way to make a living. There are Chinese merchants in California. There are very few of these, but they're very prosperous because what they're able to do is buy goods that might remind the immigrant population of home, right? And so textiles and the like are purchased and sold within the Chinese community. You also see restaurants and cooks, right? And what's interesting about this approach or this business within the community is that as the business grows, they actually employ more Chinese. Rich and I were talking, right? That trend never really stops. In fact, the Chinese restaurants start to sell other foods. So it's not uncommon to see a Chinese cook preparing traditional American dishes. We also see sweatshop labor. And at one point, this is actually 2/5 of all the Chinese in San Francisco work in some kind of factory, producing things like jeans, jackets, largely supplies that are used for mining, which is a field that ironically they're being discouraged from going into. And then I think most strikingly for me and right, for Rich and I, we were talking about this earlier, right, is the laundry service, right? Having a laundry is seen as a pioneering occupation because you could take it anywhere you go, okay? It's allowed to grow, right, because the laundry service as a labor force, as a service for the people in California is not seen as a threat. In fact, doing laundry fits the social definition for an inferior race. So you saw laundry businesses popping up all throughout the state. And we'll talk about this later, but there are laws that are actually passed to prevent this as well. It's not because the other groups want to do laundry, it's because they don't want the Chinese to acquire economic power. Okay. So continuing this kind of look at Asian labor, Chinese labor in particular, let's look at the railroads a bit more here, right? The Chinese were recruited actually as an experimental labor force. And what that really means is that there was dangerous work that they weren't able or interested in paying other groups for. So, Rich was explaining this to me earlier, right? Like this split view of labor. Rich, can you maybe expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So there's this notion in sociology. It's a concept that's coined by Edna Bonasich called the split labor market theory. And so workers are split along various lines, whether they may be ethnic or in this case, quote unquote, racial, in order to undermine the workers' ability to bargain for better wages or working conditions. In addition to that, often the labor is split in terms of the duties that people would take on. And so the dangerous duties, for example, setting up the explosives in the mines are oftentimes for the railroads to dig through tunnels in the mountains and in the rock, were often given to Chinese immigrants. And that's where one of the sayings comes from, you don't stand a Chinaman's chance. It was the fact that they were put into these dangerous situations and they often died from them as well.
Yeah, and all their work, of course, is going to lead to one of the more significant feats in American history, right? And that's the connecting of two major railroad lines, right? And so in 1869, the first what we call Continental Railroad's connected, and it's the primary artery to get from the East Coast to California. So, right, that rail line is going to enjoy quite a bit of a profit margin because they're the only way in. What happens next, of course, is, right, just a few years later, right, a second Continental Railroad's completed. And what happens next, of course, is there's a price war that occurs. Two main ways to get to California. The businesses start to compete with one another. Prices drop, So we're going to see a surge, right, of people moving to California. It's going to create this influx of more people trying to get to California where there's land and opportunity. What I want us to consider, right, is how is this going to impact Chinese workers? What is going to happen now that the railroad's complete and there's an influx of more people vying for the same resources? And so to appreciate this, let's look at the actual photo that's taken when these railroad lines are completed, right? This is in Promontory Point, right? This is a picture of the grand completion, right, of this railway. And if you look closely, you'll see that there are no Asian, no Chinese workers at all. In fact, they were denied, right, access to be part of this photo. So it's this grand exclusion, if you will, of history. And this is going to continue, of course, because what happens next is you see the initial prosperity and then this astonishing amount of poverty, all right, and alienation that's going to occur, right? When the railroads are complete, there are actually 10,000 jobless Chinese in California. And what this does is it increases competition for other jobs, right? There's 10,000 workers who now don't have work going into a state where that's getting flooded with more people, more immigrants, right, from different states into California, right? What also occurs, of course, is that those immigrants that are moving here, the other Americans that are moving from places like New York, from Ohio into California, are getting introduced to Chinese for the first time. And they are meeting Chinese in a setting that's going to be tainted, colored by the existing hostility. And so this is some propaganda that you see, right? The way that Chinese are presented to other groups as they're entering California, they're going to take these images and then go back with them, right? And now, right, these assumptions about the Chinese are going to get spread, right, throughout the United States, right, and throughout, of course, California. What I remember when I first learned this, I kept saying to myself, but other groups do this, right? Don't other groups also come to pursue the American dream? And so just as a quick example, right, let's look at, right, a batch of immigrants from Europe, right? Scandinavians, right, 63% moved to the United States. These are of male immigrants, Italians and Greeks. And then you look at the return rates there. So it's clear that many are also staying in the United States, right? So if you look at Northern European immigrants, you get huge populations that settle in the Great Lakes area, right? And so what's the difference between their experience and the experience of Chinese, right? And there are three big ones that we have to be mindful of, right? The first is the role of race or socio-race, right? The social construction of race. They're perceived as different, and it's not something that you can take off, right? If you look Asian, right, you can't deny that, right? There's also the region that they come from, right? So if you're from Europe, there's a greater likelihood of some level of cultural familiarity, right, than if you moved from, say, for example, China to the United States. And then perhaps most painfully and significantly is that the Chinese were actually the first voluntary group to be shut out by the United States government. What do I mean by that? In 1882, this law is actually passed, right? It's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And you can see I've highlighted in yellow there, right? The Chinese laborers, right, they're essentially seen as a danger to the good order of the country. And so the United States bans, it prohibits immigration of Chinese to the United States for 10 years. This is going to get extended multiple times. So in 1882, there's a hard stop for folks moving in to the United States. And so the population of Chinese immigrants into the US is going to drop. Again, another image, another cartoon propaganda, if you will, that gives us an understanding of what it might have been like to be in the United States at the end of the century, right? You see the sketching on the wall there, right? Communist, nihilist, basically everyone's welcome except for Chinese. And so those who do try to come in run into a different barrier. And as they're trying to enter the United States, they get sent to a place called Angel Island. This is a large island in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. And I just selected a handful of things here to share with you briefly. Right on the right there at the bottom is actually poetry that's carved into walls because immigrants who were moving from China to the United States arrived and were put in holding cells. That's on the other two images on the screen there at the bottom, right? And they had to prove that they were actually related to somebody who was here. And so in some cases you had folks entering with forged documents, others with documents, but they were not written in English. And so this ended up becoming a very hostile holding station. And many immigrants were actually turned, put right back on a boat and sent back. And they never made it to the mainland. Now, this decline in immigration from China, of course, doesn't mean that the demand for labor has stopped. What instead occurs is that demand is met by a different group. And so the next wave, as you recall, maybe from what the slide I presented earlier, is a push of immigrants from Japan. Mm-hmm. And so we see an increase in Japanese immigration following the Chinese Exclusion Act. But this is stopped actually in 1908 when a gentleman's agreement is signed between the Japanese government and the United States. And what the gentleman's agreement does is it reduces immigrant Japanese labor. It actually, there's a promise that Japan will not allow Japanese laborers to leave Japan to go to the United States. What they do allow, however, are family members of those Japanese laborers, and they allow women. That is not something that happened within the Chinese community. And so because there were so few women in the United States of Chinese descent, the Chinese population in the United States actually stagnated. It did not grow, right? The opportunities for success stayed low. Because women and families were allowed to move into the United States, right, by the Japanese government, what you're going to see, of course, is a more successful result, right? So the Japanese became, one of the fields that they went to were tenant farmers, right? They found success reclaiming Stump Land. Now, you might be like me and asking what Stump Land, and you think of a really good coffee joint in Portland. No, sorry, that's bad reference to Stumptown Roasters. I don't know if you're into that stuff, but that's Stump Land. Stump Land develops when you get the logging industry coming in and cutting down trees and leaving soil that can't be farmed. The Japanese were willing to come in, use TNT and blow up the land, remove the stumps, and then turn it into very profitable farming land, right? And so this is going to, of course, create success. Now, if you take all these factors together, what you see within the Japanese community is that dual income households emerge, right? We see, a creation of greater success within the community, and of course, eventually children. Now, children born in the United States are US citizens, which means that the Japanese immigrants can purchase or even rent land using their child's name. So the Japanese are going to find success in California as a result of this. And what do we know happens when a group achieves success as they're trying to compete for resources? They're going to run into negative sentiment, right? And so here you see an image, a huge sign on a woman's house in Hollywood. That's Hollywood, California, right? Telling Japanese to not stay in certain areas. This, of course, is going to worsen as we get closer to World War II and Pearl Harbor. And so next, let's look at the increase in this hostility. And to really appreciate that, I want to highlight a 1942 Gallup poll in the United States that looks at characteristics of Chinese, right? Chinese are seen as hardworking, honest, brave, religious, intelligent, and practical. This is, of course, nearly 50 years after they were denied entry into the United States. Actually, 60 years. And the Japanese are perceived as hardworking and intelligent. That stayed, but they're then also perceived as treacherous, sly, cruel, and warlike. And what happens in the US is that immigration restrictions, right? Because now the Japanese are not wanted in the United States. So they turn around and lift immigration restrictions For Chinese in 1942, they're now allowed back into the United States. And for Filipinos and Asian Indians, right, in 1946. So you see a surge of that group again. And all of this is really driven by this type of sentiment, right? Right, that's World War II propaganda. And all this comes to a head when we get to the signing of Executive Order 9066. I'll let Rich talk about this. I'll put some information up here. Rich, you wanna?
Yeah, sure, I'll jump on in. Yeah, so it is really important to try to, again, look at this history, right? In terms of that split labor market that's being formed, that as from the very beginning, when Asian Americans are faced with oppression, they didn't just take it. They would fight back. And I think Mike has some slides that he's going to go over in a few minutes of people fighting back and the kind of responses that they received. But as they fought back, right, people began to see them as more and more undesirable. And so various exclusionary acts would be applied to each group. And as each time one group was being excluded, another group would be brought in to fill the labor needs, but also, and this is really important, to undermine the power of the workers, including white workers. So even today, it's really important for people to understand that there needs to be, right, this understanding of class and the building of coalition and its importance to better people's lived conditions. But yes, as Japanese Americans began to make strides, there was this response by some in the white community, like the White Growers Protective Association, that began to push for alien land laws, which I believe we're going to discuss in a few minutes. That was in about 1913 to 1923. But as time goes on, right, there's still this push to take Japanese Americans off of the land that they worked hard as tenant farmers. They worked hard as farmers, toiling, making land into something that was very usable. And so there was a push. We often think of World War II and Executive Order 9066 as removing Japanese Americans from the West Coast and placing them into concentration camps because they were dangerous or because they were spies. And nothing could be further from the truth, because our own government was conducting studies on that at that given time. And so reports that are coming out, like from General DeWitt, clearly show that there was absolutely no evidence of espionage. But looking at it more from the economic, right, angle, as Ida B. Wells Barnett pointed out, as the Japanese Americans were coming up, in some cases, not all were, right? I don't want to simplify it. There were many who were also working class, working poor, but there were those that Mike mentioned that were doing well, that were owning land, farmland oftentimes. They were dispossessed of it. So these are about 2/3 were American-born citizens put into camps, like in the middle of the desert, like in the case of Manzanar, and they lost what is now, estimated at about $2 billion to $5 billion worth of property. Who gains that property, right? This is accumulation by dispossessing a population. This could have been used for generational wealth, etc. Instead, it goes into the hands of individuals that were able to maximize their wealth based upon it.
And so continuing this, right, I want to look at the kinds of anti-Asian sentiment and the way that they were expressed in U.S. history. So I just realized the time. I feel like I need about 7 hours, but I'll pick up the pace here a bit. This is recorded, so if we do have to go back again, we can do that. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So let's look at prejudice, right? One kind of anti-Asian sentiment is expressed, right? So labels were used against Asians, and that's probably really powerfully displayed on the cartoon that you see, this political cartoon on the screen, right? That the Asians are inassimilable because they're not homogeneous, right? Their false perceptions were doled out, right? They developed exotic images to emphasize difference. You can see that again in this cartoon. If you look at the length of the queue on the person there, look at the exaggerated eyes, even the hands in some of the pictures, the clothing. And other stereotypes are peddled, right? That they're opium addicts, pimps, or beasts of burden. And these labels, these images, this information is spread really by 3 different groups. First, we have diplomats who resent elaborate Chinese protocol, right, in the Chinese courts when they are doing state work. We have merchants who don't like the limitations on trade that are being developed by China. And then we have missionaries who complain of a slow conversion rate within the Chinese community. So you have a mechanism to spread this information. And this prejudice really rears its head to me if you look at one court case in particular, and that's the People versus Hall. And I want to highlight some parts of this, right? That the opinion of the court here is that the words white, right, Negro, mulatto, Indian, black person, wherever they occur in the Constitution, right, must be taken in their generic sense. And that even admitting the Indian of this continent is not of the Mongolian type, that the words black person, right, must be taken as contradistinguished from white, right? And necessary excludes all races other than Caucasian. And here's the kicker for this case, right, this court decision, guys, that the same rule which would admit them to testify in court would admit them to equal rights of citizenship, and that we might soon see them at the polls, in the jury box, upon the bench, and in our legislative halls, excuse me. This case essentially denies the rights of Asians, of Chinese in particular, to serve as witnesses in court cases. So when we see the next set of slides about the various kinds of economic or physical hostility that's experienced by Chinese, you realize pretty quickly that they become powerless to defend themselves, even within the legal court system. So let's look at some of this discrimination, and I might move through these quickly. So we talked about the foreign miners tax, right? That's $20 a month for non-native miners. We also see a capitation tax in 1855, excuse me, right, $50 per person on board any vessel that's not eligible for citizenship. It's eventually going to get ruled unconstitutional. The Chinese fisherman tax, $4 a month fee for Chinese fishermen. It's going to get repealed 4 years later. The Anti-AAPI Act, which has prevented southern plantation owners from replacing their enslaved workers with unfree laborers from China. See the police tax, $2.50 a month. That's a fee for Mongolians, right? Those are folks from Asia, right? This is going to get ruled unconstitutional 1 year later. Cubic air ordinance prevents the rental of rooms with less than 500 cubic feet of air per person. It's eventually going to get voided by the court 3 years later. The sidewalk ordinance in 1870 in San Francisco prohibits carrying loads on poles on sidewalks. The Q ordinance in 1873 required every Chinese person to cut hair to 1 inch. That's going to get vetoed by the mayor, but the fact that this comes forward as a potential law is striking. There's a laundry ordinance that requires laundries employing horse-drawn vehicles to pay $1 in tax. Those with no vehicles have to pay $15 in tax. The folks with no vehicles, of course, are the Chinese. That's going to get vetoed by the mayor, but again, it's a law that comes forward. The California Second Constitution, excuse me, in 1879, this is legislature is given the authority to protect state, counties, and cities from the presence of undesirable aliens. Corporations were forbidden to hire Chinese. Chinese were forbidden to work in public works. Legislature is given the authority to remove foreigners outside city limits. You can see how this is building up, of course, toward the Exclusion Act. And then the state statute that prohibits Chinese from taking fish out of California waters. This is also going to later be ruled unconstitutional. Again, continuing this, what we're going to see are land laws.
Real quick, Mike. So when you
Yes.
look at the taxes, right, the amount, keep in mind at that time, the Chinese immigrants are making about $3 to $4 a month. So it's a significant tax. Sorry.
Yeah. So let's look at land laws, right? Could you buy land, right? And so the alien land laws initially passed in 1906 and then again in 1913 prohibit buying or owning land by aliens ineligible for citizenship. You can only lease it for 3 years. So what ends up happening is that Asian immigrants would come in, lease land for 3 years, develop it, and then get kicked off the land. And then a white farmer would move in and take over soil that was already prepared. right? And, this is not enforced during World War I. So Asian and Mexican American farmers provide most of the farm labor in California. We're going to see that the significance of that trend in a bit, right? In 1917, right, laws are passed to prohibit American-born children of immigrants ineligible for citizenship to own land until they're 18. Right, it's going to get continued so that these, again, American-born minors cannot purchase land.
It's crazy.
Immigrants ineligible for citizenship could not acquire, possess, enjoy, use, cultivate, occupy, or transfer any real property. And then this is not ruled unconstitutional until 1952. Right?
Yes.
That's,
If we had more time, we could have talked about the naturalization laws too and how they were implemented in a very racist fashion, but we won't have time for that today.
yeah, well, so let me just continue so we can get it again, just try to get a deep sense of the need for resilience, right? Anti-miscegenation law, right, 1906 prohibits Chinese from marrying non-Chinese. This is going to get nullified in 1948 in California. So in 1880, right, if we look at the section of the Civil Code that regulates marriage licenses, right, we learn that, marriage licenses could not be issued to white Mongolian marriages. Right. In 1921, Filipinos were ruled as not Mongolian, so marriage licenses were issued. This is going to change, of course, in 1930 when the Philippines is going to acquire independence. And so the court rules that there could be no white Filipino marriages. California anti-miscegenation laws are going to be declared unconstitutional, right, in 1948, and then across the country, of course, not until 1967 will the laws that forbid intermarrying get removed from our legal system. Another kind of aggression against the Asian Americans is we can take a look at the immigration exclusion, right? So we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but one thing that precedes the Chinese Exclusion Act is actually something called the Page Law in 1875. And this prohibits the importation, this is the actual language, of unfree laborers and women from China, Japan, or any Oriental country, brought for immoral purposes. Now, that's with the assumption that women migrating from Asia were going to become prostitutes. So this law is going to deny them entry, and what it does, again, is it prevents women from entering, Chinese women from entering the United States, and that's going to be a mechanism to control population growth. We talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I want to quickly highlight that there were 5 classes that were exempt from the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's teachers, students, merchants, tourists, and officials. Everyone else was denied entry. The Scott Act prohibits re-entry after temporary departure. This gets extended 3 times, so once you leave, you can't come back. Right? The Immigration Act prohibits entry of aliens over 16 who are unable to read. So again, if you learn another language, this is going to go against you, right? We talked about the Gentleman's Agreement and that impact that has on Japanese immigration, There's a Barred Zone Act that creates a barred zone extending from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, from which no persons were allowed to enter the United States. The Johnson-Reed Act, also known as the Alien Act, right, excludes all immigrants ineligible for citizenship, including wives and children. It's also going to restrict immigration to 2%, the total number of people entering the United States based on the 1890 census. So they're using census numbers that are 34 years old. What this does, of course, is it's going to create an overwhelming preference for immigrants from Europe. Okay, it establishes the Border Patrol, and it does not change actually until 1865. The Magnuson Bill in 1943, is going to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act. And as we talked about earlier, that's largely because of World War II and the relationship that the United States has with Japan at that time. The Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934 says that Filipinos were no longer nationals, which is what they were when they were a colony of the United States or a territory of the United States. And so what this act does is it establishes a quota of 50 immigrants per year from the Philippines. And in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act is going to change our quota system so that 85% of immigration quotas were reserved for Western and Northern Europeans. A very small percent is, of course, going to be allowed for Asian immigrants, and Japan's immigration is capped at 185 people annually. Now, again, so this is horrific. Let's shift gears and again, continue to look at this and look at instances of physical violence experienced by Asian Americans in United States history. So in 1871, there's a stretch of Los Angeles where we saw violent crimes occur. 15 Chinese were hanged, 4 were shot, and 2 were wounded. Just so you know the difference there, the distinction is that the wounds come, in this case, not from guns, but from other weapons. In 1877 in Chico, right, in Sacramento Valley, again in California, a group called the Order of the Caucasians actually ties and burns 4 Chinese farmers. In 1885 in Washington Territory, the Anti-Chinese Congress issues a manifesto stating that all Chinese must leave Tacoma and Seattle. 600 residents were actually displaced as a result of this, and 2 were murdered. And their property, including the whole of Chinatown, is actually burned down. The violence continues within the Asian American community. So in 1885, there's a massacre at Rock Springs. And this starts off as a simple labor dispute among coal miners, and it turns into a massacre, right? 79 homes are burned, 28 people are killed, 15 are wounded, and 16 white miners are eventually arrested and released on bail. Although the massacre occurs in broad daylight in front of other people, right? No one would swear to having seen any crimes. So no charges were actually filed in this case. Right, the response from the federal government is actually an agreement to pay $150,000 in damages, and that's after there's pressure from foreign governments. And in the words of the representative for the Secretary of State, right, this $150,000 that's issued for damages is issued solely from a sentiment of generosity and pity, and they will not acknowledge that any legal, right, anything legal was violated. Continuing, right, if we look in 1907 in Bellingham, Washington, 500 white men, mostly members of the Asiatic Exclusion League, actually, they brutally attack Asian Indians in an attempt to drive them out, right, from railroad and lumber industries. And so what you see here are actually a group of Asian Indians who are forcibly brought into the city hall. And the Indians in the community actually end up moving and huddling around City Hall just for their own safety. Continuing this look, right? In 1913 in Hemet, right? That's in Riverside, if you're not familiar. Koreans are threatened. They're actually forced out of their homes. In 1921 in the San Joaquin Valley, 58 Japanese are roused, put into trucks, and dropped off at railroads. They're threatened with lynching if they return. 6 men get arrested, but all are acquitted. In 1930, this hits a breaking point, particularly among Filipino farmers in Central California, in 2 different places, actually. In Watsonville, from January 19th to January 23, hunting parties actually target Filipino farm workers. 400 are attacked in the Northern Monterey Filipino Club. 2 Filipinos are killed, and in this case, 7 men are arrested, but none are indicted. In the same year, right, on January 20th in Stockton, California, white men bombed the Filipino Federation Building of America. Again, no arrests are made there. And so what I want us to appreciate is something that, right, Rich cautioned us about earlier, right, that when we look at scapegoating and physical violence, right, we have to appreciate the historical events that lead to these atrocities. So in 1873, right, the Depression reaches California. In 1886, we see industrial upheavals. There's a whole series of strikes, so workers are disenfranchised. Between 1860 and 1920, the rapid growth in California broadens this chasm between classes, so the wealthy become extraordinarily wealthy, and the poor and the working class become even more displaced, and so they look for scapegoats. And of course, if we're looking at the events that I just described in Watsonville and in Central California, right, we're looking at the height of the Great Depression. And so what we refer to this as is a growth sequence, right? That we see hostility change with the appearance of each new groups. And so we go from spontaneous outbreaks, right, to the formation of legal defense committees, to mass meetings, to protest punishments, and then to political groups that force Asian immigrants and their families out of the United States. That pattern, unfortunately, is one that is reliable historically.
Mhm.
Now, so this is the kind of the setting for the need for resilience. And so transitioning slightly here, right? Let's look at a case where this works, where groups look at each other and they lean on each other. And that's if we look at farm workers in the United States, particularly in California. And so we're familiar, we celebrate Cesar Chavez Day in California, but many don't know that the man standing next to Cesar Chavez in both of these pictures is actually a very significant figure in labor history, right? That's Larry Itliong. And he actually establishes the first union for farm workers, and it's a union for Filipino farm workers. And they gather and try to create a coalition of workers to challenge their conditions. And as they initiate their strike, they actually partner with, right, Chavez's organization, and we see change. Rich, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, man. And so when we're looking at these exclusion laws that Mike was talking about earlier, this is exactly what it's trying to prevent, right? As we block Chinese from coming in, as we block Japanese from coming in, as we block Koreans from coming in, as we block Asian Indians from coming in, as we blocked Filipinos from immigrating as well. The attempt was to have a more controllable workforce, but instead what we see in our history is the other side, right? This notion of resiliency. And so one of the very first inter-ethnic unions that was formed was the Japanese Mexican Labor Association. I think it was in 1907 in Oxnard, California. But that history continues on, as you can see, with Larry Itliong and Cesar Chavez, with the United Farm Workers and onward. And so I think this is a very important point that Mike is making, that this type of coalition, right, existed then, and it still exists today, but it is often ignored in our history, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's a good example of groups coming together to try to get past the what I'm going to call a problem when race becomes an ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have to be able to see past the simple social construction of race. So another example of this, I think we can see in higher education, actually, right? At San Francisco State College, which is what we now call San Francisco State University. In 1968, 1969, there's a strike. The Third World Liberation Front strikes are organized. And student organizations, and if you look at the listing of organizations there on the left of your screen, that's a very diverse group of student organizations. They come together to force the institution to develop an ethnic studies department on campus. They issue a series of demands. They're striking to read, and they might be more timely now than they have ever been to go and look at. But what this coalition does is it helps lead to the creation of these programs, these requirements, right? This, which amazingly is what we're disputing today about critical race theory, right? It's born out of this. In fact, when we think of ethnic studies at colleges like UC Berkeley, right, at Cal, what happened at Berkeley actually follows San Francisco State University's lead. But again, it's an example of groups coming together to try to get past this. I just saw, I got a direct message here about the time. We're nearing 6:30. I have about 4 more slides. I can keep going, or we can stop for questions. What's the will of the group?
I wanted to add something real quick, then, if you're going to start for
absolutely.
questions. So I think it's really important, right, again, to contextualize the hatred that we're seeing against Asian Americans and why it's developing. Oftentimes, there are these structural changes that are occurring within our society that people often have no control over, and they may not even realize it, where very powerful members of our society are making these decisions that negatively impact the lives of the workers and the middle class. And unfortunately, as we see throughout history, Asian Americans and other members of marginalized groups have become targets, right? They're used as a distraction from the larger issues that are going on. So again, I just kind of keep coming back to this. If people begin to critically examine, right, the conditions that they're living under, and then create coalitions to try to bring about a better society, then I think some of this kinds of hatred will begin to wane, hopefully. Just wanted to kind of squeeze that in there.
Yeah, and so we see these examples of resiliency, right, among the farm workers, and then and the coalition building among educators. The struggle, unfortunately, rears its head again, right? And what we're going to see during this period, of course, is a war in Southeast Asia, and then an entry of other groups into the United States. And what do we know happens in the US when we see entries of significantly sized bodies of other groups entering the United States? Is we're going to see a struggle reemerge, and the struggle is going to continue. So we look here, what we see in Seadrift, Texas in 1979. Rich, you want me to keep reading and then you just jump in, or?
I think they want us to finish. It looks like.
Okay. All right.
I'm just reading the messages. Man, there's so much. I'm sorry too. We could talk about this stuff forever. Obviously, Texas, or the Vincent Chen case, or the, even modern times. There's just so much that relates.
I think they mean they want us to finish. Like, keep going.
That's even better. Than go for it, man.
All right,
I love it.
Yeah, well,
I love it much better.
I'll keep my pace, and I hope to only go over 5 minutes, my friends.
I'll add on this then, brother. I could do
Go
this
ahead.
real quick then. Yeah. So this notion that the struggle continues, right, is really important. We were talking about the 1800s, right, early 1900s, mid 1900s. Now we're bringing it to the later part. It's Mike and my lifetime, right? So it doesn't stop. With regards to Seadrift, Texas, we have Vietnamese, right, refugees that are basically being targeted by the KKK and other fishermen because, again, they're seen as undesirable, unfair. These are words that keep coming up. Competition. And so force is being used to try to drive them out. Violence is being applied against them, threats, etc. And then in the 1980s, in 1982, this is a really important case that I know Mike and I remember like it was yesterday. I was already a teenager by this point, the Vincent Chen case. And so what was happening kind of quickly in the 1980s is that Japanese automobile manufacturers are being very competitive with US automobile manufacturers. And so the US auto plants were starting to suffer, right? And there was also the reality that we're moving into the post-industrial capitalist economy, and changes were occurring because of that. But most people weren't examining these conditions. And that's why it's really important for us to always critically examine, right, what is going on. But instead, powerful members of our society began to provide really simplistic notions of whose fault it is. So instead of all the bigger issues that were going on, it's because of those Japanese, right? They didn't use that word. And so they began to target Japanese. And there was this thing called Japanese bashing back in those days. And it culminated in this horrible situation where a Chinese American, right? He's not Japanese American, was targeted. And the two laid off auto workers that attacked him basically said that it's because of you little MFs that we are unemployed. I think that was the line that was used, and Vincent Chen was killed. What's striking is, as Mike has right there, they did no jail time. They only received $3,000 fines and 3 years probation. And these kinds of struggles continue on, right? As Mike pointed out, in 2000, when the Chinese spy plane went down, there were calls to place Chinese Americans into concentration camps like they did the Japanese Americans. Again, not separating, right, Asian Americans from the struggles that the United States may be having with Asian nations. So this perpetual foreigner stereotype or myth continues on. And based upon that, people that are prominent scientists like Wen-Ho Lee in 1999, or even more recently in 2014 and 2015, a hydrologist and a physicist, were basically alleged, right, of spying from China. Like in Wen-Ho Lee's case, it was horrible. He did 9 months in solitary confinement. That's basically torture, right, when you think about it. And in the end, of course, all charges were dropped because there was no evidence. And as it says here, there was a person, the security chief by the name of Roman, that came forward and admitted that the colleagues targeted Lee, Dr. Lee, because he was Chinese. And so what we see today in the 21st century, right, has a long, long history, and it's continued to the present. And so it's very important for us to examine what is happening at that, at these various junctures that lead to the scapegoating or the hatred, etc.
Yeah,
Oh, that's another one too. The
yeah,
Burmese
sorry,
American family.
I glossed over 2 slides that highlighted recent incidents. I apologize.
Yes. No, that's
I
sad.
think we're just trying to be sensitive in case there were questions, but
Go for
right
it.
on the slide here, you see, right, this is 2020. This was last year, my friends.
Yes.
Right, a man and his family are actually attacked with a knife, and you see the images there of them requiring surgery, and of course, these images at the bottom, these are very fresh and unfortunately in our minds, right? That scapegoating during the pandemic has continued. In fact, it's escalated dramatically, and what's happening, of course, is that you're seeing groups who should be standing side by side actually turning on each other in some cases, which is unfortunate. And what I hope we're able to do is get to this point, right? And appreciate this, right? That Asian Americans have fought back at every point in our history, excuse me, using different methods, from physically defending ourselves to taking movements to the streets and courts, and to participating in the political process, right? That to me is, I think, a great reminder of the resilience. So that although there are a whole series of horrific examples here that may shake you to your core, I think it's important to understand that there is a will to push back. And I would say that in addition to pushing back, it's equally important to be able to lean on others and to learn. So thank you very much. I apologize the rushed ending there. We were, I think, a total of 7 minutes over. I thank you, everybody. I'm happy to stick around if there are questions. I don't know if that's allowed by the people organizing the event.
Oh.
Yeah, if folks want to stick around and ask questions, feel free to stick around. I know that our interpreters are here until 6:30, so if you would like to stick around, that would be greatly appreciated. But if not, we want to be respectful of your time.
Absolutely.
But please, if you are open and willing to stick around and ask our presenters questions, please feel free to do so. I know Hazel, you might have gotten some questions direct message to you, so maybe we can start with those.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Oh,
Sorry about going over.
I'm seeing a question here. How are they getting goods or resources with little money? So yeah, the goods are there. So there's bartering that's happening as well. And I think what's really important to understand when we think about goods is we have to think about the living conditions that folks are actually have accepted, right? So what we might think of as goods that we need, I think are not the case for those early immigrants, right? They in many cases even saw themselves as sojourners. Oops, my screen just. Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, we went back to regular Zoom. I apologize. Okay, thrown off there. Right. So, and if you see yourself as a sojourner, right, the purpose of the migration is to go and gather resources so that you can share them with your family. Right. You're coming here to try to seek that opportunity and then get back. And so, again, I just think that's important to understand the difference in standards.
And also, it wasn't only the working class that was coming in, as we were talking about earlier, merchants, right? Some of them were relatively well off. And those that weren't, oftentimes they pooled their money and resources together to buy, a business or to buy the commodities that they were going to sell. So, so it was a little bit more complex. I know if we had a lot more time, maybe we would have touched upon it, but there are many ingenious methods that were used to bring people together, to lend money to each other so that they could start these businesses and be successful at times, not always successful.
Very successful social organizations like Chinese 6 companies that actually got together and they would pay for even transport. And that those early community agencies were very vital. I know that within the Philippine community, you also see them as well. And within the Filipino American community, excuse me, they're actually extensions of the local towns that people lived in the Philippines. And so you see that extension, and those associations have a very prominent role in Asian American history.
Great. Did we have any other questions, Hazel? Checking the chat to see.
Oh,
Okay.
that's
no
sad.
other-
Okay. Cool.
Oh, hi there. I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
I just had a question regarding the people that are recording this event.
Yes.
For the, I don't know if you guys know, for the Armenian commemoration event, like that took place across the entire week. Will you guys? They said they were going to be recording them and placing them on the they shared the link with us, but they have not recorded it and they have not posted them yet. I just wanted to know, like, if you guys would be doing the same, if you guys are going to be posting all the events that occur this week.
Great question, Sean. So we're working on compiling all of the videos for the Armenian Genocide commemoration. So just stay tuned on that. We're working on getting those closed captioned and uploaded to YouTube. And just for future reference for the Asian Pacific American Heritage Month videos as well, we will also be archiving them and they will be available after a couple of weeks when we conclude our programming.
A couple of weeks, so in like 2-3 weeks, you would say?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, it just takes some time for us to get it uploaded and make it accessible for viewers.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You as well.
You too, Sean.
Goodbye.
Cool. Any other questions? Any questions for Professor Mike or Professor Kamei? We got a comment from Sandy Somo. Mobilizing resources is a common strategy among many immigrant communities. It's how we work to build ourselves and each other up. Absolutely.
So true.
Thank you for that, Sandy.
Thank you.
Well, it seems that if we're not having any other questions, we really encourage you all to attend the next upcoming presentation. Again, this week is APAHM History Week, right? And so Professors Delay and Professor Kamei have really kind of provided us with the past history here in the United States about different legislation that pertains to some of the bias and xenophobia centered around Asian Americans. But we're really coming in and bringing some people from the grassroots movement to come in and provide their perspective. So we encourage you all to please join us. And please check out the webpage for our programming. I believe Hazel will put it into the chat. Any last words before we kind of close things off, Professor Delay and Professor Kamei?
No, just thank you for staying late.
Yeah.
We apologize that we went a little bit over.
Yeah, I think the commitment to trying to understand this and then hopefully, you know, share, right, each one teach one, right. If we can get this information moving along,
love it.
I think we're a lot stronger when we're standing together and learning from each other. So
yeah,
I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.
Yeah, if you have any other questions, you could always reach out to us too. Please don't hesitate.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Delay, Professor Kamei. Have a great evening, everyone, and we'll see you at the next event this upcoming Wednesday. Take care.
Take it easy.